Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, from wherever in the world you may be joining us today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFAL York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the 7th session of the Emerging and Systemic Risks monthly lecture series co-organized by Y-Emerge and CFAL York with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Tekaronto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event and our participants may be joining from various locations, I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speaker, and our participants from around the world. Without further ado, I will pass the floor to Dr. Wu to introduce Y-Emerge and the moderator.
Thank you. Good day to everyone. I'm Jianhong Wu. I'm the founding director of the York Emergency Mitigation, Engagement, Response, and Governance Institute, or Y-Emerge. Y-Emerge is a pan-university center of excellence at York University that builds on a network of expertise from 6 faculties to develop, to grow, to sustain transformative and multidisciplinary research and teaching in transformative disaster risk reduction, emergency preparedness, response, and recovery. This emergency systematic risk monthly lecture series is in coordination between Y-Emerge and CFAL, as well as York VPRI Office Support research clusters on urban disaster and health emergency system risks. We're very pleased to see this monthly event has been providing a powerful platform to bring faculty members, trainees, and our associate members around the world together to understand research and training frontiers in the subjects and its impact on the society from our distinguished speakers and panelists. So we particularly appreciate the contribution from our distinguished speakers and moderators and the panelists, and I would like to take opportunity to introduce our moderator today, Richard Krasbaum. And Richard is an emergency planning specialist program manager of community and health service emergency manager, York region. Richard is very known for as a disruptive innovator, and having worked for many different governments across Canada, including York region, Peel region, and the government of the Northwestern Territories. And you may also know that before his career in emergency management and business continuity, Richard was a jazz musician. I think that's contributed to his career. And Richard served in the Canadian Armed Forces. With that, Richard, I will pass this to you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu, and thank you for having me as a moderator today. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Ed Conley. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Ed. Ed served nearly 3 decades with FEMA, leading teams around the globe in response to some of history's most significant disasters. He has also managed international incidents and international emergencies with the U.S. Coast Guard, Secret Service, and Centers for Disease Control and Department of State. Appointed as U.S. liaison representative with NATO, Ed traveled throughout Europe on emergency preparedness assignments. Before joining FEMA, he spent 7 winters on the National Ski Patrol, an instructor with the Center for Domestic Preparedness and National Emergency Preparedness Training during his career. Ed resides in Seattle, Washington. So I'd like to welcome Ed, and I look forward to his presentation on the 5 principles of leadership.
Thank you very much, Richard and Dr. Dr. Wu, thank you. I appreciate the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to discussing this topic to you, which is a passion of mine, very dear to my heart. I was thinking back, what it's like to work in this career, work so many disasters, and the question people often ask me, and I'm sure they often ask you, is when you reflect back and what do you remember the most? What were the worst disasters you worked? And I'm sure all of us have our list. And of course, I remember 9/11. I remember Katrina. I remember wildland fires in Montana, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the Columbine school shooting, a tornado on the Ogallala Sioux Reservation, typhoons in the Western Pacific. And I remember those events, and you can't forget the death and the destruction, despair, and the challenges that the communities and tribes and nations have to confront and overcome. But what I remember more than the death and the destruction, despair, and challenges are the people, and the people I met, and especially the people who stepped up, rose to the moment, and made a difference. And made a difference in their family, in their community, in their neighborhood, their state, their tribe, their nation, and help contribute to that path of recovery and resilience. And I'm fascinated by people who step up in those moments, in those extraordinary moments, and do extraordinary things. And what are the traits that they have? What gives them that sense of fearlessness, that maybe a reservoir of courage, a willingness to take a chance, embracing risk, and making tough and decisive decisions, not perfect decisions, maybe imperfect decisions, but nevertheless decisive decisions in moments of crisis. And my conclusion is that it's a commitment to having a set of principles, a set of leadership traits that whether they articulate them or not, it's just something, foundational belief that they have in them, that they count on, and it gives them that reservoir of strength and courage at a crucial moment in their lives. And after working hundreds and hundreds of disasters, that's what I've discovered, and that's what I've studied, and that's what I've wanted to share with you. The idea that leadership principles are available for anyone. You don't have to be a president. You don't have to be a prime minister. You don't have to be a governor, an organizational leader. Really, anyone who works in the realm of emergency management, in any position, at any level of the organization, can begin to develop, embody, and capture for themselves a set of leadership principles that they can take from event for event, from challenge to challenge. And when they're faced with a dilemma, a difficult decision, perhaps even an ethical, moral, or legal question that where they need to decide what to do, this gives them that extra foundation, that extra reservoir of knowledge and courage to make those decisions. Now, what are leadership principles? They are not necessarily institutional. While all institutions in emergency management do tend to develop a core set of principles, they tend to fluctuate and change based on political winds, changes in administration, personal preference of agency heads. I'm talking about a personal rather than institutional set of core beliefs. And I'm also talking about a set of core beliefs and a foundational set of principles that perhaps you can use for your professional life and your personal life, and too. Not only do they not only do these principles help you deal with decisions, I think you will find that often people use these principles not to replace, but to help supplement the training that they've received, our incident command systems, our incident management systems, our response and recovery and mitigation frameworks, our doctrine, our operational strategies, tactics, and policies. definitely does not replace it. It's a supplement to that. So why have them? Why, you ask, why should I develop principles? What's the importance? And I think it's a relatively simple question to answer. If you look at the landscape of emergency management and where we stand now, I can't imagine an industry, a profession, a field of endeavor that perhaps requires having a core set of foundational beliefs more than our industry does. You look at the changing nature of disasters. You're looking at vast population growth in high-risk areas. You're looking at, for instance, we used to have a wildland fire season. Now we no longer have a wildland fire season. We have massive fires in Alberta in late April and early May. We also have seen the consequences, and we're wrestling and trying to anticipate how we're going to deal with climate change and what impact that's going to have. We've seen the rise of violent extremism. So our landscape is constantly evolving, changing, and I think the demands on us are becoming ever more important. There's also the idea that we have, I think, a coming generational change in our industry. When I look at the statistics of the demographics of people who work in emergency management, one thing that jumps out to me is the age. I think a lot of people in the next decade or so, we're going to see massive amount of retirements, change over. So the new incoming generation of leaders are going to be very quickly asked to make important decisions and find themselves with opportunities to make huge contributions. And I think now is the time for them to begin thinking and maybe contemplating some sort of core beliefs that they have that they can carry with them to help them make decisions before they are suddenly thrust in crucial decision-making positions. My methodology for observing and coming up with some principles and sharing them with you is not, despite what my friends may have told you, I didn't just throw up all my ideas in the floor and whatever landed face up, I picked up. I actually had somewhat of a systematic approach to analyzing and coming up with core principles that I recommend to the new generation. A lot of it obviously is based on personal experience and observation, working 100 disasters and a wide range of disasters, different scope of disasters, assignments that varied from anywhere from a week to a year. I conducted a lot of interviews as I began to ponder, explore this topic of principles in emergency management, personal and professional principles of emergency management. I talked to not only seasoned veterans, not only people who had high-ranking positions in the field, but I talked to a lot of newcomers, particularly people in their late 20s and early 30s, which seemed to be the average age of people who entering the emergency management profession and field. I asked them, what are their fears? What problems are they trying to solve? What are they trying to, or what do they need help with as they begin to enter and manage their career? I studied a lot of historical events. I didn't only examine the disasters that I worked, but I went back to disasters in previous centuries, earlier pandemics, the 1900 Galveston hurricane. I looked at some of the people and humanitarian impacts of wars over the years. And then I also read a lot of historical fiction. I found historical fiction was a very valuable resource to explore personal dilemmas, crisis points. And I enjoyed reading how authors sort of explored that topic and explained the personality of characters and how they all had some flaws. A lot of them experienced failures in their life, but they had something inside them that at a crucial moment where they had to make a decision, they had a core belief that they counted on. So those were, in terms of my methodology, just a broad range of resources and just both a storytelling and observational, but also more systematic and scientific approach to developing principles and offering principles for your consideration. For today's discussion, I wanted to share with you five that I thought are interesting to me. It's certainly not the end all to be all list, but it's a sampling. And I think more than in addition to the principles I'm going to share, I think you might be also interested in my thought process for how I came up with these. And I really had a 5-set criteria when I decide to suggest and recommend a principle. And my 5-set criteria is I must be able to define it. It's more than just a mantra or a cool sounding phrase. Those are great, but what does that mean? So that was my first criteria. I wanted to look at why it was important. How does this principle, of course, relate to our emergency management field? Why is it important? What difference will it make? And then I thought it was very critical to explore practical steps that, okay, if this is a principle that you'd like to embody, you say, this makes sense to me. How do I do it? What steps can I take? What's practical and realistic actions can I take to begin to develop and use this principle? And it, in part with how to do it, I looked at what are the watch outs? Where did people do it wrong? What should you avoid doing to compromise this principle? And then the final number 5 point, when I evaluate principles, is I look for a transformational or transcendental component capability. Does it have bigger meaning beyond just contributing to a particular decision point in a particular crisis, but does it have a transformational capability? Can it help transform your career? Can it make contributions beyond broader communications to the disaster, maybe even contributions to our entire field? So that was my final and 5th criteria. I was looking for some sort of transformational or powerful capability within a particular principle to see the great good it could potentially do. And the first one that I talked quite about a lot, which is relatively simple sounding, and I think you'll find that most of these are not necessarily complicated or difficult until you begin to maybe dive into it a little bit. The first one I pick and I talk about all the time is the idea of showing up. And it's something that we hear quite a bit, not only in our industry, people refer to it in your personal lives, private sector industry, you hear it a lot in the sports arena, and the idea of showing up. And I think it's a concept that everyone has a basic understanding of what that means and why it's important. But let's talk about what that means in the emergency management field and why it may not be as easy as we naturally assume it to be. So when I say show up, and when I talk about embodying the principle of show up, to me, it means really 3 things. It means to be on scene. It means to walk the rubble, to smell the smoke, to trudge through the flood mud, to actually feel and touch, smell, and be part of on the scene and the impacts where you at least can see it yourself, and maybe as a responder, as part of the emergency management community, participate in that event, you are in some way impacted as well. Number 2 for me was who you connect with and who you discuss and interact with. I found that when I worked for FEMA, day to day, between disaster responses, working on mitigation or preparedness or other important program activities that we do, typically about 85% of my day was dealt with talking and attending meetings and exchanging emails and phone conversations with other FEMA people. 85% of the people I talked to tended to be FEMA, and oftentimes the other 15% was family. Day to day, I had relatively little exchange and interaction with people out of my organization. However, when you show up on a disaster, I found that ratio was often reversed. And I found it was a good metric, a measuring stick. If I was showing up on a disaster, if I was on scene and I was embodying that principle of actually showing up, participating, engaging in that event, then I was typically dealing and interacting 85% of the people I was meeting and talking with were outside my organization. They were with other federal agencies. They were tribal leaders, state, local communities, community influencers, nonprofit organizations, the full realm. There are people at rental car agencies, hotel desk clerks, individual survivors. If I could hit that mark of 60 to even 85% of my interactions were people outside my organization, then I felt I was showing up and I was actually fully engaged in that event. And then the final third criteria that I had in my toolbox to determine have I showed up on this event or not was, did I have a title? Did I have a specific assignment? Was I accountable for something large or small on this particular event? So those are my three criteria. Was I on scene? Could I touch it, feel it, smell it? Was I interacting with more people outside my organization than inside? Did I have a specific title for that event? Now, why important? Why do we push this and encourage the idea of showing up? I will say, first of all, that the expectation shouldn't be, and it is not that when you work in emergency management, you show up to every single event, regardless of the size and scope. I think it's very fair to assume that you just need to show up some of the time. Of course, you have the all hands on deck, the big events, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Katrina, where everyone goes regardless. But it's important that you do throughout your career, and whether you specialize in mitigation, preparedness, or responsive recovery, you're on the resilience side, you're in policy, whatever, you work at the national headquarters or you work in a local regional office, at some point in your career, you need to make those efforts to show up and be unseen. For the simple reason, I don't understand how you can understand the scope of your programs. I don't know how you can understand the delivery and the impact of the programs. I don't understand you can understand the specific needs of the community and the public expectations for what we do unless you actually there and participating in it. I was reading the other day about some of the community meetings that were taking place in Alberta, and I just found it fascinating because I'm a big believer in those community meetings, as difficult and as challenging as they may be. But there's something about when you're at a survivor and they're holding your arm and they won't let go of your arm and they ask you, what is going to happen? What am I going to do? How am I going to bounce back from your event? Well, suddenly in those instances, what we do, I think, takes on a whole added importance. And you begin to really fully grasp and understand the impact of what we do and the service we provide. It will change. It can change your perspective and make you better at what you do. I would say it's also important because we see the emergence of these and the consequences of these events are often not what we expect. When you show up, you begin to really conceptualize how unpredictable, crazy our business tends to be. And I think we all sort of intellectually get the idea that, yes, disasters never unfold according to plan. You may be thinking that your next event is going to be a hurricane, and it turns out to be a historic oil spill. And we see that, and I think intellectually grasp and contemplate that. But it's something different when you're in the field and you're experiencing it personally and you're seeing it. These unanticipated consequences, you're seeing levees fail when you never expected levees fail. You were expecting people to evacuate it according to the plan. They did not evacuate it according to the plan. And something about seeing it, understanding how these unexpected consequences, unexpected challenges, changes to the environment, the landscape, and how we need to be able to adjust and be more flexible on the fly in very stressful, intense situations. It's hard to replicate that, train for that, understand that, and grasp that, and incorporate that in your operational mindset unless you experience in the field. So for all those reasons, and I doubt there's much agreement there. It's just, you know, throughout your career at various points is, and some people, you know, obviously do a lot of on-scene stuff more than others, but in any capacity, wherever you work, I think you can see those benefits of changing and improving your ability to perform and contribute to our profession by being on scene. The thing of how you do it, I would say it was interesting to me when I talked to people about who I thought demonstrated the show up. There are people I admire. They seem to be fearless. There are people that every disaster I got, they'd always seem to be there before me with a cool, calm, collected nature, ability to be unfazed by the events. But in doing my research, without an exception, every one of them told me that every event, regardless of how big, how much media attention, how much political engagement there was in the event, every event they're involved with, they had a set of nerves. Some described it as fear, some described it just this anticipation, the weight of expectations, whether they would be prepared and be able to move and shift quickly on unexpected challenges that were their way. So one of the biggest things of doing the show up thing is recognizing that nerves and fear are a constant. We all experience it. And you have sort of a decision point in your career is whether you're going to let that fear of showing up and responding to the event take hold, or whether you're going to somehow learn to manage that. And the people who embody and embrace that show up principle, that fear and the nerves and anticipation never goes away. They just recognize it. They have self-awareness and they have tools and tactics for managing and dealing with it. Some people, it's not similar in organizations, but I definitely saw it within FEMA, which is perhaps an organization you don't expect to see it. I saw people within FEMA throughout their career that became quite adept at not showing up. And the fear of being on scene, they let that win, and they would not, they would have excuses. They would find reasons not to go. There are people who actually did quite well throughout their careers in FEMA who have managed to rarely, if ever, show up to a single event. So it does happen, and be aware of it, and be aware of that fear and expectation is something you're going to have to manage. The other challenge we have that makes showing up much more easier to say than to actually do is the nature of our business, which is you can't predict when, where, or what disaster is going to occur. Our timing is in many ways our biggest challenge. So you could be on vacation, you could be fully involved in another event, you could be deep into planning or seminars or some other equally important event or activity when a disaster happens, and you have to make decisions on where your priorities lies, and so showing up. So that again, the idea that it's often easier to say showing up to do, and if you in recognizing these challenges that exist and these things that we have to deal with, be able to embody this principle. And then I would say the third thing that a particular interest to me that I've become quite focused on lately is that people who show up embody what I call the first responder mindset. And there is quite a debate that goes on in the emergency management community, whether or not emergency managers are first responders or not. We definitely don't have necessarily the life-saving mission of a firefighter, a police officer, emergency medical technician, a doctor, or nurse, or some of those professions. Obviously, we are more in the coordination role, but at the same time, we do preach and promote the idea that everyone, to some extent, is a first responder. So I have come down on the side that people in their emergency management community are first responders. They need to embrace that concept and take on that responsibility. So first responder to me is basically arriving prepared so you'll be able to make a contribution, no longer be a burden on the impacted community. So I think if you can take on just those three simple things, you begin to really represent and embody the show up. You're recognizing that the fears and anticipation and nerves are always there. You realize that this career, this profession makes enormous an ask of you in terms of because you cannot anticipate the timing events. And third, that you have a certain level of readiness and commitment to yourself that you are going, when you arrive at, you're going to be able to not necessarily be able to contribute. And one of the simple ways you contribute is by not being another burden on the impacted communities. So we always say there are 4 ways to show up on a disaster. You don't show up, you show up unprepared, you pretend to show up, which is when you come in and drop in without a title or a position. If a few days, we call those disasters. And then finally, the show up to make a difference. In terms of the transformational impact, the enormous power and beauty of the show up principle. It's remarkable how many survivors I talked to had mentioned that just seeing emergency management community on the scene, not expecting them to be perfect, knowing them in mistakes, admitting that there were frustrations with them, especially at the front end. But on reflecting back, survivors have told me over and over again, they go, you have no idea what it means when you've lost your home, your community's been flooded, wildfires are raging out of control outside your city limits, to see that your nation, your state, your province, and out of area volunteers have recognized what has happened to you, care what have happened to you, and have showed up to try to assist you in that event. And then in terms of a transformational, in terms of your profession, to show up, I think our legacy is so much revolves around what disasters you work. When I look at very famous people in our profession, the retirement, that's their legacy. That's what people talk about, the disasters where they showed up and they're on scene. That they've chosen to be a participant in a history at a critical moment. And that for every response, no matter how big, and whether it's in history books or movies, or whether it's just remembered in community folklore and family stories, but you were a part of that response, and you'll always be a part of that response when you show up. Now, my next principle is interesting to me. It's somewhat of a tactical principle. It's something that I use personally a lot, and as I began to share it, I was surprised at how much it resonated with people. And it's what I call the think in threes. It's an organizational tool, and leaders I talk to a lot of time, they actually use this organizational tool, even if they haven't articulated or really had a frame of mind for it. And it's basically looking at the idea of a concept of 3 as a listening tool to identify issues, as a tool to help them set priorities, especially priorities at the front end of a disaster, and then as a communicating tool, as a tool to help communicate their priorities, their objectives, their strategies, both internally and then externally to the general public at large. I think why important is just in the, it's a concise, it's a very simple, it's a very readily available tool to help you capture issues, identify objectives, and communicate actions in simple, direct ways. So let's take a look at it in terms of identifying issues. I was 1 year assigned by FEMA to explore schools and crisis situations and disasters and school shootings and the impact on schools, and to find some valuable takeaways to share with community leaders and school superintendents and school teachers and principals, regardless of what sort of threat or concerns they had for their particular school district. And over again, what came back to me when I talked to different people involved with school events is that, one, have a plan, two, build relationships and network outside your school district. And then number three was look at the mental health challenges after a crisis, which often are there's much more demand for them than you would often anticipate, and you'll need them for much longer. So that's an example of the thinking in threes and a very simple thing of valuable issues. And I tested these theories, this feedback all over the country, and I've received strong support. Yes, those three make sense. In terms of think of threes instead of priorities, when we flew into New York after 9/11, our first three priorities were to go to the Javits Center, linked up with the search and rescue teams. And number two was to meet our counterparts with the city of New York. And our third priority was to find a hotel for the night and make sure we had reservations and a place to sleep when we finally were ready to call it a day. Were those the best priorities we could establish? It didn't matter. All that matters is that we picked three things to do and immediately began to work. So that example of the time of threes. And then perhaps the most powerful, even the transformational impact of using this relatively simple principle, but which many underestimate, but it actually packs quite a punch, is the idea of expressing leadership intent, using words to inspire, using words that people can hold on to. And I talked to Tony Russell, who was the superintendent of the U.S. Center for Domestic Preparedness. In 2009, Tony took over the Federal Long-Term Recovery Office in Louisiana for hurricanes Katrina, Gustav, Rita, and Ike. In the situation was quite a mess. The recovery in Louisiana had stalled out. Relationships were just horrible. Nothing was getting done. And Tony, I said, "What do you do, Tony?" And he said, "You know what? At every meeting I had with the staff, at every media engagement I participated in, and at every community meeting I attended, and every visit I had with the governor, I said the same three things, and I said the same three things over and over and over again." And what Tony said was, number one, the federal government is going to take a look at every eligibility decision, and we're going to give everything a fresh start. Number two, we need from now on everyone who has a stake in this process to be a full participant in these decisions. And we need everyone who has ability to solve these problems to be a full participant in these solutions. And then Tony told me the number three thing I said is, right now, from now on, this is one team, a federal, state, and local team. And together, we are going to restore emergency services in Louisiana and New Orleans. And we're going to begin repairing public-owned infrastructure, such as 911 dispatch centers, public-owned hospitals, and your roads and sewer and essential public facilities. A simple message, 1, 2, 3. He repeated over and over again, and he credited that commitment and that message and that using that frame of map and this simple principle to begin. He goes, "I really believe, Ed," he told me, "that it began to shift the momentum." I just said it over and over again, and I think people grasped it, participated, and it was something to remember. So that is the idea of thinking threes. The next one I have is this talk straight principle, which is the idea of having in your back pocket a communications principle. I don't necessarily like the word crisis communications. I prefer emergency information, emergency and public information, but it's a principle for organizing, managing, delivering life safety and life-sustaining and recovery information to impacted populations. The why it's important to have a principal dedicated to public communications. Information, in my mind, in a crisis is just as important as food, water, and shelter. It's such a valuable resource that helps people take action, understand their role and responsibilities in the response and recovery process, and participate in the emergency management system. It's critical for public trust. I think when we look at our emergency management system, as beautifully as they are constructed, and well organized and filled with dedicated professionals, they are so fragile. At any event can begin to erode that public trust that's so essential for our system to be essential and effective. And I really believe public communication and a commitment in the form of principle that you carry with you to disaster is absolutely that essential to the ensuring and retaining that public trust in our system, what you do. So specifics, what do you do? How do you embrace this principle? How do you practice it? How do you use it? And one is having your communicators have a seat at the table. They're not making sure your communicators are fully integrated in all elements of your response operation, that you value public and emergency communications. It's not about just public relations or defending your positions, or trying to get good press and praise, but it's really valuing and seeing information as a resource that you need to develop, manage, and deliver throughout every response and recovery element, and really within all phases of our emergency management system during prevention and preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. I would say another way to embroaden it that a lot of people have told me when they're saying the talk straight public communication principle is that they highly recommend you. And one of their big worries is this: we seem to have a reliance on new technology at the expense of old tools. For instance, now we're evaluating artificial intelligence and how we may be able to use that, and what our management challenges are going to be associated with that. But Twitter and Facebook and all these new technologies, but often those, not often, but they can fail at critical moments. They have failed at critical moments. See, one of the things in terms of the communication principle that a lot of people recommend and how you do it is don't throw out the old tools. Remember the loudspeakers and the bulletin boards, consider leaflet drop-ins. And embodying this principle is not necessarily replacing old tools with new technology, but adding new technology to your toolbox, but keeping the old tools there as well. And in terms of the transformational and transcendental component of this talk straight principle and embodying talk straight and how powerful it can be, it's amazing to me how every after action report and review that I've gone through on disasters, public information, public communications has been raised often as the number one issue and level of concern. And regardless of that, I worry that we continue to make the same mistakes over and over again in our industry. And I'll give you one quick example, and that is the idea that the public will panic. And it's something I've done quite a bit on research too. And I know our academic community has done a fantastic job, especially in the behavioral research end, and looking at people who respond to disasters and exploring the idea of a public panic. It may be the misuse of the word in emergency management, because we have this assumption oftentimes as emergency responders that people will panic. But if you look at this from a historical perspective, it's actually extremely hard to find any examples of mass public panic, and even the most horrendous events. It's also the actions that are described as panic are actually actions based on fear, and they tend to make sense. Rushing out of the Twin Towers after 9/11, climbing up the to higher ground when faced with the tsunami. But regardless of this, we tend to look at panic over and over again as an operating principle and something we need to avoid. It happened in the 19 great influenza. It was an operating principle. And then during COVID-19, I heard President Trump of the United States talk about it quite a bit as an operating principle, trying to avoid public panic. And so it goes back, I think, to this principle of talking straight, which is really at a centerpiece, the idea of building trust. And it just seems to me that as emergency managers, if we're asking people to trust us, if we're asking them, and if we recognize how important public trust is in our ability to do our jobs, then maybe perhaps that starts first with learning how important it is for us to trust the public. And then I am jumping now to facing failure. The idea here is to have a principle to help you manage and overcome setbacks and challenges in your career. We deal in an industry that, to some extent, it is an industry that responds and deals with failures and challenges. But the idea of failure, we're not necessarily in the, I would never say we're in the failure business. I always believe we're in the comeback business. But the idea is that failure to some degree is inevitable in our business because there's so many ways it can happen. A coordination breakdown, communication breakdown. And then because we ask the people in our profession, we ask our responders, we ask our lifesavers, we ask our technicians, our operational folks, our policymakers, people in the academic community who do so much to support us. We ask them to take risks, to take leaps of faith, to provide at least a framework where we can make decisions quickly. And when you work, of course, in that environment, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to screw up, you're going to make imperfect decisions. So it's inevitable, but in our business that we are both we're facing failure, trying to overcome failure, and then we also are experiencing personal challenges and failures in our careers. But failure may be inevitable and never insurmountable is sort of the framework and the belief in the core concept of this principle. So how do you develop and how do you use a facing failure principle? I would say really three ways. Number one would be have a frame of mind. Just that it will happen. You're not the first one it's happened to. You won't be the last one it happened to. And that a lot of this business and a lot of your success in the emergency management profession is predicated on your ability to bounce back from failure, to learn to persevere, to continue on, to fail and rise again, to fail and to rise again. And just having that simple mindset, that frame of mind that it will happen, it does happen, and that you need to show your poise and be able to step up and stay in. And those who step up, stay in, persevere, inevitably have long-term success in our profession. Another one is a plan to deal with setbacks. You know, as simple as saying, I have a plan. A lot of people at some point or another have used the apology strategy, which I think when sincerely delivered, it acknowledges that you understand the mistake that's been made, that the impact and consequences of it, and that you have the confidence to be part of the solution. So there are different strategies to deal with setbacks, having a plan, apologizing, that you consider. And then the third part of doing this and doing this particular thing well is looking at ways you can mitigate and overcome failure, embracing the idea that our business is about coordination. It's about leveraging resources. It's about building long-term positive relationships. It's about making friends. It's about welcoming new arrivals into your office, to your organization, to your incident command post, and making them feel welcome, defining for them their mission and integrate them. It's not about being territorial. It's not about losing control. It's understanding that relationship between coordination and control, and that emergency management is all about coordination and very little about control. Actually, the word control in emergency management is also used to define not what we have responsibility for, but the limits of our authority in a particular event, and how we need to elicit, communicate, collaborate, and coordinate with others to get things done. In terms of the transformational impact of facing failure is, again, we ask, and I think to succeed and do well in this business, in this profession, is you have to be a risk taker. You have to have the courage to make decisions. You have to act. Oftentimes the worst decision you can make is going to be way better than no decision and just letting problems continue. But with that requirement, with that drive requirement, with that expectation, with that responsibility that you have to be a risk taker, to make decisions, to do the best you can, of course, become setbacks and failures and challenges and things that always go well. So I think having this facing failure principle embodied and part of what you believe in, and that you have access to tools and tactics and lessons and friends, certain strategies to help get through either personal setbacks or institutional or organizational mistakes or failures, is just really crucial. And the most powerful, I think, successful and inspirational people in our industry, every one of them has a failure story, often more than one, of things that they've lived through, things that they did, and how they bounced back for it. And then finally, we have my last one, which is come home, which is the mental health aspect of emergency management and being this profession. I would say with the young people I talk to, especially and those in their late 20s and early 30s, this was just a really important principle, and something that they wanted to learn how to manage. Every one of them brought it up. And the problem, I want to commit to this profession. I want to be an emergency manager. I want to help people. I want to make a difference in my community, my tribe, my nation. But I want to know how to balance my professional and personal life. I want to be able to know how I can stay passionate, committed to my job, and not get bad out. How do I not lose my empathy? All those sorts of questions and worries a lot of people brought up. So the idea of a come home principle, I felt, was just really important and something for people to consider. So what do you do? How do you do it? How do you begin to embrace it? Presidential historian and author Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about, from a historical perspective, this idea quite a bit. And she looks at people like Theodore Roosevelt, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln, what they did. She gives an example of Abraham Lincoln, and she tells a story that, during the Civil War, U.S. Civil War, President Lincoln went to the theater 100 times. I looked at Admiral Spruce, naval officer who helped lead to the Allied victory in Battle of Midway in the Pacific during World War II. While he was planning for this milestone, important battle, really, which would begin to shape and could impact the war in the Pacific, he would walk every day up to 10 miles. He would take the time away. So the idea that great leaders find and commit and take the time to relax and replenish their energy. Mayor Pat Owens, when she was mayor of Grand Forks, North Dakota, after their historic flood, she just found she would get a lot of inspiration and a lot of inspiration and replenish her spirit when she talked to school children. Whenever she felt down or discouraged about her community's recovery, she would go visit a schoolhouse and talk to children to cheer her heart. Really, there are four things that you might want to consider incorporate if you like to take this principle and make it part of yours. You could look at a spiritual aspect to your life, whether that's religion or yoga or practicing mindfulness or meditation. A lot of people have an art or creative component. They play an instrument, they write, they draw, they paint. There's exercise, that's very common. A lot of people are dedicated to have a regular exercise routine that they practice throughout their emergency management profession, especially when they're deployed. And then there's the idea that we have access to therapy, counseling, and the importance to make sure we do have access to therapy and counseling. And when we're down and we're discouraged, and we just have someone to talk to, and we have access to that. So I would always say, in terms of the transformational aspect, the people who do this and incorporate this principle really seem to be so successful in their career that and they have happier family lives, which of course makes them more effective and valuable on a disaster operation, because they don't have those worries or burdens necessarily that they have to deal with it while they're trying to help others. They're able to lots of times sustain a very long, successful career and have that enthusiasm, that passion. They don't let the critics and this discouragements get them down because they come home, and they come home before they show up again. So those are my 5 principles for your consideration. I do want to reemphasize again that this is not the end all to be all lists. I encourage people to go ahead and talk to leaders who have inspired them, who they admire, and maybe get some ideas for them. You can get it from movies and books as well, or looking at historical examples. But I have seen these principles work, and I want to share both these 5 principles, especially for people entering the care and emerging generation of leaders. And also I want to share with you my thought process and how I evaluated those, and then specific steps that I personally try to practice and that I've seen others practice to try to embody and demonstrate them. I'll close with this quote from Dr. Maya Angelou, which I just love this quote. And it is another example of perhaps this too is a principle that you might want to consider. I think it's something that I might do as well. So that's it. I'll turn it back over to you, I believe, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. That was fantastic. I really like the one, your principle on show up. It's the one I actually have to stop doing sometimes because my staff get a little nuts when I want to get out of the office. So, and your rule of 3 also resonates, and especially when we talk about communications and the 3 messages, as well as I don't know if you've ever heard of David Canterbury. 1 is none, 2 is 1, and 3 is I think it's 3 is 2 or something like that, where 3 is your backup. So it also works for resource management as well. So it was great. So I'd like to open up for questions, and if people want to raise their hand, and we can open up allow you to speak. Sorry, I don't know what to say that function is, but if you have any questions for Ed, please raise your hand, and we'll turn your mic on, and you can ask a question. Okay, maybe since there's no questions, maybe I'll start. So a question I had around some of these principles. Do you notice any particular subsect of emergency management, people with military experience or people who just came out of school and so forth, show any of these more consistently than others?
Yeah, I would tell you, I think the military is a good one. The military is very interested to me, Richard, because they're, especially in the United States, we have a lot of ex and former military people that emergency management is their second career. And for some of them, it's a really difficult adjustment because emergency management tends to be a little bit more wacky. You get more eccentric personalities. It's a little free flowing culture. And it's not as necessarily structured and disciplined as military might be. We always say in emergency management, we don't march and we don't salute. But at the same time, I've found that, military people, they bring really a wonderful wealth of intellectual curiosity. They really like the idea of principles, of a frame of mind, a concept of core beliefs. And in the thick of threes, I see it demonstrated quite a bit. And it works especially well. And the military have taught us really the value of the think in threes, and that is in leadership, the idea of leadership intent. The military people are trained not to accept a void, not to accept indecision. That is our mindset. They're training. But they are so respectful of the military civilian authorities, as long as an emergency management community, we are expressing leader intent. We are defining the objectives of a response, a recovery or mitigation mission. We're clearly describing what our expectations are for the team members and different organizational elements of an operation. And we're defining both the plan and the outcome that we expect. And the military has defined this as leadership intent. And what's beautiful about working with military is when you give your 3 priorities and you have military members of your team, whether they're retired, now part of emergency management, or they're active duty and have been deployed to help assist with the mission, is that if you give them your 3, okay, here are our 3 objectives, here are our 3 priorities. Here are our 3 talking points for these community meetings. They will tell you leadership intent. Got it. We got leadership intent. And so I just find that that the think of these principles seems to resonate and really be valuable with the military, but really all of them are because they bring this wonderful intellectual curiosity as part of their training and development as professional soldiers, sailors, and airmen and airwomen.
Perfect. That's fantastic. Thank you. I'm actually going to have to turn it back over to Francisco for any further questions. I have to head to another meeting, but Ed, fantastic to hear you speak, and it was nice to meet you.
Richard, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, no problem. I will take over. We do have a couple of questions coming in now in the Q&A. So I will start with the first one from Mahmoud Delavar. Says, thank you for your excellent presentation. Could you summarize 5 principles mentioned and evaluate them in terms of sensitivity analysis to sort them based on their importance?
Okay, so the 5 principles we talked about today were show up, think in threes, talk straight, facing failure, and come home. And I don't know if I can, I would think they're all of equal importance. A lot of it is a personal preference. You may find whether you have particular challenges in your personal life that you really want to concentrate on to be more self-aware of, that you find yourself maybe getting down on certain events, you have a hard time letting go, you have a hard time, you're thinking of decisions you made, how you can do better. Maybe, the come home principle is a particular importance of perhaps a benefit to you. For me personally, when I first joined FEMA and began working in disasters, I was a horrible communicator. I really struggled to explain concepts and ideas and to express myself concisely and succinctly. And the Think in Threes was a lifesaver for me, both in terms of my career development and also in my ability to do my job better and to support my organization and to work with survivors and communities. So Think in Threes really was something for me personally that I've just found extremely valuable. It really helped me get myself organized and be much more productive and effective in my career. So a lot of it, I think, is personal preference. I love them all. And there are others that people have embraced and that are very important to them. I have a friend in Norway who works in crisis communications and crisis response. And one of his principles is he just really values the role of the arts and humanities in the emergency management profession. He just thinks it's a really important principle. To him, it's a core principle that we incorporate the arts and musics, oral histories, that we visit museums, that we visit in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. There's a trail, and there's markers where each of the 13 firefighters died in 1994 during the Storm King Mountain. He said he thinks it's important to walk that trail and visit that site and reflect on those things. Go to New Orleans and look at the final resting place for the remains of victims of Katrina who went unclaimed. So that's an important principle for him. So I think a lot of it is important personal decision, but you might also look at evaluating maybe what your organization does well, or your leadership does well, maybe things they don't, and look at, well, this is something I need to be prepared to do on my own. So I hope that answered your question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that was a good answer. And yeah, from what you were saying, I think that, yeah, a lot of it would be, like you said, personal, kind of what you want to put your focus on, and be prepared on your own, especially if it's not something your organization focuses on too much. So we have a couple of more questions from the same participant. I think these two can be, or actually, I think all three of these questions can kind of go together. So I'll ask them, and maybe you could answer them together, or if you want to answer them one by one. But the questions are, how does data quality impact the decisions during search and rescue operations? How can the Internet of Things affect disaster management? And how accurate and up-to-date maps, images, location-based social networks, and BGI, how can these support disaster management?
Okay, I'll take the first one. During search and rescue, I think the big data is huge. Obviously, you want to know, if you're looking at Turkey and Syria, you're looking at Haiti 2010, you're looking at Ground Zero in New York at 9/11. You definitely want a sense of the numbers that you may be looking at. But I would say, almost maybe for me, specifically for search and rescue, is having a discipline to follow the process. And first is grids. Establishing the grids, because you typically have lots of teams coming in from a wide area for these mass search and rescue efforts. And so you need to make sure that you're not duplicating efforts and you don't have everyone searching the same spot, which it was a huge problem in Haiti 2010. There was not a good grid system set up. So you even had search and rescue teams from the US and France and other countries. They would just drive around until someone waved them down. And it said, I think we hear someone trapped in the rubble here. No one had a design territory. It was very chaotic. So that's an important part of the process. Letting the dogs run first, letting the dogs run before the area, securing the area and letting the dogs run first before the area is contaminated with smells is critical. And then having the right equipment. Then you send in your structural engineers to assess the safety, so you're not getting your search specialists and your firefighters killed while they're trying to rescue someone. So all those process things to me are more important, are equally important than the data, maybe even to some extent more important than the data. In terms of the internet, one way that I looked at the internet and the new technology, I always see a crisis situation. You go from a situation of almost information void to information overload. That happens very quickly at the onset of a big incident, particularly a no-notice incident, like a terrorist attack or an earthquake, but also in a notice event like a hurricane. In those first hours or even days, you really have a void of what's going on, what are the impacts, what are we dealing with here, what's the size and scope, what are the consequences, what resources need to be seen. A lot of norms and out of guesswork at the beginning. but then your challenge becomes not information void, but information overload. It's almost, there is too much information. And it's, fed through Twitter and all the internet platforms. And a lot of it's sorting out, what's reliable, what's accurate, and what's not. It's an enormous challenge for responders in the emergency management community. And a lot of it's based on, sometimes the more information we have, the more difficult it is to make decisions and become less decisive. So learning to manage that is, I think, a big challenge in terms of the information flow and going from void to overload. And both recognizing the value and the benefits of all these social media platforms and the internet, but also recognizing the challenges they impose on us as well. And then maps, I love maps. I love that sort of data. I tell you what, when it comes to maps, you really hit sort of a passion point for me. I love physical maps. I love actually holding a physical map in my lap. And when people brief on a situation, I love following and the route they're talking about, and the communities are talking about, and looking at the mountains and the stream and the hazards and how big an area might be. All that I just find that extremely valuable. And I learned that from Admiral Allen, commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard during Hurricane Katrina, when President Bush asked him to take over the operation, when the federal government really was faltering and failing at the front end of that response, and he took over, and his job was stabilize it. And I sat in his office with him quite a bit. But whenever Secretary Chertoff called him to ask what was going on the ground in New Orleans, Admiral Allen would get up, he'd walk to the wall where he had a huge map. And as he briefed Secretary Chertoff on what was going on, he would trace his finger across the map and tap on the areas and the communities and the segment of the response operation that he's talking about. That stuck with me, and so I copied that style, and I always carried a physical map with me.
Great, thank you very much. There's just one more question in the chat, and so maybe this will be the last one, unless anything comes in or if anybody raises their hand. But yeah, the last question here is from Sandal, I believe, asking, were you involved in any capacity with COVID-19 and the CDC over the last 3 years? And a second part to the question is FEMA preparing for the next pandemic?
Those are great questions. So I was not on the inside. I had already left FEMA, so I was not a federal employee. I was not responded to COVID-19. I liked my thing. I have some observations as a survivor and someone who lived through it along with everyone else. I do have some strong impressions about it. I'll share with you. I'm still researching this, and it's specifically US specific. I was really confused by the unified command setup at the White House and the organizational structure that they use, especially at the front end. I know that President Obama and the CCD and the Emergency Management Committee had really developed a pandemic playbook. We had been working on pandemic planning for decades. I'd been involved in exercise, and there was a lot of planning and a pretty good plan in place, I thought. And it's just seemed to me that Trump administration sort of threw that all out and kind of went through it well. And I was just really confused. You had the president's press conferences, you had the vice president had a task force. You had Jared Kushner had sort of a troubleshooting cell. You seem to have overlapping and duplicating assignments going out to FEMA and the Federal Emergency Management Community and the CDC and the National Institutes of Health. And I think eventually got sorted out, but at the front, I was really confused, not only by the public messaging coming out, but by the organizational structure that they had set up. But I was not on the inside. But those are my observations as a student of crisis response. And then, within the United States, really public health responsibilities, primarily the responsibility of CDC. But I think one of the takeaways that we've learned from COVID-19 is that the Emergency Management Committee actually has a tremendous skill and capability to help assist with public health emergencies. And it's something that I think those of us who work in emergency management often take for granted, but you don't see it emulated and done as well in organizations. And that is the idea that in emergency management community, we really understand the concept of coordination. We have we live with it every day. I think to accomplish almost anything in our emergency management profession and emergency management lives is we have to ask the question, okay, to do this, who do we need to coordinate with? What community or tribe or organization? Who else is going to have some funding, some resources, some management or technical expertise to help get the job done? It's a question we ask when we're faced with every challenge, when we're putting together every policy with every program, and when we're responding to every event. And sometimes I think we take that for granted, just the beauty and the incredible gift that we are given, that we're taught just the value and how to coordinate, how to collaborate, how to build relationships, build teams, and work with a wide variety of people, both inside and outside organizations. And a lot of organizations, they tend to be much more insular. They don't, on their day-to-day, they tend to just work alone and do their stuff and do it well. But then faced with a big event, a global event, widespread event like COVID-19, suddenly they have to, for the first time ever, be in a coordinating role, work with that organization. It's a whole different mindset. So I think there's still going to be the role of the public health communities can be in charge of public health communities, but I definitely think a major takeaway from COVID-19 is going to be a much larger integration and a quicker integration of the emergency management community in those events. We're not going to wait to involve emergency management. It's going to be at the front end and throughout the planning process, because we have a lot of friends and relationships. We know how to structure meetings. We know how to coordinate. We know how to bring people from diverse organizations and expertise levels, languages, and everything else, and bring them together.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I think you touched on a really important point there on the silos of these different organizations and the importance of bringing them together for a global response such as COVID. Well, I think with that, I don't see any new questions popping up or any hands being raised. So I think we can end it there. Just on behalf of myself and Dr. Wu and Dr. Gary and Sarah and everyone at CFAL and YEmerge, thank you very much, Ed, for that great presentation and for all your insightful answers to the questions as well. And thank you to Richard, who had to leave, but thanks for moderating. And thank you to all of the participants. And just as a reminder, our lecture series is continuing. Our next session will be on June 15th for anybody who is interested in catching the next lecture. Just keep that marked on your calendar. And as always, we'll be sending reminders out before the session. So yeah, I think that's great. Thank you very much.